This is such a wonderful opportunity to speak to a group that, in a certain way, comes lately to the notion of deep ecumenism in relationship to Jews and Judaism. Um, but the encounter, the dialogue that has taken place in, say, the last 30, 40 years with the Eastern traditions and the Western traditions has been remarkable and is a sign of the paradigm that's shifting in um, relationships between spiritual traditions. So I want to start on a personal level and then go to a more historical um, review of relationships between spiritual traditions and then bring it to the present. So the ecumenical service. Now, let me define terms because I just used one that sometimes gets misunderstood. Deep ecumenism is a term that was coined by the theologian, the Reverend Matthew Fox, who's located in Oakland, California, who is the author of so many books, particularly focusing on Christian mystics. He was a Dominican priest, and he was defrocked by the office of the Inquisition, by the one of the future popes, um, and he was invited to become an Episcopalian priest after his defrocking. He coined the term, and we put up on the invitation originally that he said he was quoting the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart, who said that divinity is an underground river that no one can stop and no one can dam up. And then Reverend Fox went further and said, there's one underground river, but there are many wells. And it would be a mistake, a grave mistake, if we confuse the well with the flowing waters of the underground uh, river. Many wells, one river. That's deep ecumenism. So the notion of one river and many wells, the wells are all the spiritual traditions, totemism, Native American religion, um, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Confucianism, all those are wells. And the river of the divine feeds each river, but each river also feeds each well, excuse me, feeds each river. So there's a um, interconnectivity that goes on in spiritual traditions. So that given, the term deep ecumenism isn't used all that often. They now like to use in certain seminaries the term interspirituality. All right. When you hear the word ecumenism, it usually refers to Baptists talking to Episcopalians. That's what it's traditionally been understood. So those are some definition terms. So when I was a child, um, growing up in a synagogue, small synagogue, and the ecumenical service of my childhood, when a member of a minister from the local Presbyterian church came to our synagogue on a Friday evening to sing and hear American religious pluralism extolled and the fine civic religious gift that it was. As I recall, getting to go to their Sunday services instead of our usual Sunday school and listening to their praying, their music, their language about God, and a complimentary sermon by their pastor. It was clear then that these were courtesy visits done only one time a year, and um, and that it was expected to be respectful to the visitors. Usually, The Protestant minister would bring a number of people from his or her church, and also we would go as a group to their church. And so the respect was a public respect. Privately, our group, the Jewish group, was informed, as I presume the Protestant group was informed, that we all knew fully well that the only one of us could be right. No matter how the reality map changed from biblical versions of the ancient Near East, or the Greco-Roman maps, or the medieval maps, Judaism shared the reality map with Christians and Muslims, and no contact with the Eastern traditions at that time. And they took it for granted that there was only one truth about God and the universe that could be right. We were all what is now called triumphalists. In the end, Daddy loved us best, and there never was a mention of Mommy. And the ancient and still current approach would focus on the differences rather than the commonality of spiritual traditions. So the standard conversation between a Christian and a Jew for close to 1800 years went, Christian question, so you don't accept Jesus as the Messiah? No, answered the Jew. That was the end of the conversation. To suggest dialogue would be laughable. In fact, between the relationship between Christians and Jews for those 1800 years, if there was a conversation, it was always a disputation. A Jew was invited to appear before the bishop of the town, and then the arguments began. No suggestion of commonality of spiritual tradition, exclusively honed in on the differences and the objections to the other. All right. So when it comes to our dogmas and the dogmas of another spiritual tradition, and this includes Eastern traditions from my perspective, the myths and the theologies, the revelations that divide us, we're all on shaky ground. Every spiritual tradition is on shaky ground. But when we go deeply into the interactions between contemplative consciousness with humility, we can understand what the other is really talking about, and to come to realize the shared commonality rather than any difference. All right. And I'll get into that a little bit more later on. The first question that we ask each of us when we engage with the other is, where are we coming from? Are we triumphalists, believing that at the end of the story, God will say, you were always right and they were wrong? Are we protectionists that guard our own borders, protecting our revelations? Or are we good citizens, glorying in the various ways that people are spiritual and really not taking any of them, especially our own, particularly seriously? Do we believe that all religions and spiritual practices and traditions are equally the same, with merely cultural differences? Or do we believe that while traditions may differ, at their deepest, they all have essentially the same goal, including the spiritual evolution of consciousness of the individual and the collectivity? If that's the case, then the dialogue begins. Right? If spiritual traditions share in common the desire to repair, to fix, to improve the world, then we have a dialogue opening up. So the problem is how to open the dialogue. So a little historical background that's really kind of instructive, and it's kind of frightening. When I looked at, from my own experience, historical experience and understanding, what I find is, as I said before, 1800 years of grinding against the other religion, both Islam and Christianity. Much of it began to change with the Enlightenment period in Europe, and specifically, the first real opening happened in the 1920s in Germany, where Martin Buber, who had very dear friends who were Christian ministers, and as he was evolving his notion of dialogue, the I thou, um, he began to look for opportunities. So he solicited the participation of Christians and Jews to step into a dialogue and to find the foundational basis for which a dialogue can engage in. He said one should speak about Jewish and Christian faith rather than speaking about Judaism and Christianity, not about doctrine or abstract theological concepts, but the way you got faith as experienced by Jews and Christians. And with few exceptions, the Christian ministers and theologians in Germany failed to take the bait. And they entered into the same type of discussions that had hampered that attempt over many years. Disputations, disagreements about theological positions, and never getting to the point of, in Reb Zalman's language, when he taught about deep ecumenism, is saying, why don't we start with the following question? How do we get it on with God? What commonalities do we share by talking about our faith? All right, not about beliefs. Reb Zalman, who is one of the um, most dramatic practitioner of deep ecumenism, because in his lifetime he embraced both the West and the East, hanging out with Thomas Merton, hanging out with Thurman, who became one of his teachers at Boston University, hanging out with the Dalai Lama, with Native American leaders, all that. Nobody had done that before from the Jewish world. So Buber's attempt to enter into dialogue failed. Later on, in the mid-20s, he decided to try it again in Germany. So he started a magazine in which it was open to Christians and Jews to contribute to an ongoing dialogue about commonalities. Once again, it failed. There was a growing sense in Germany, in the theological world, in the universities and in the churches and seminaries, this sense of let's make it clear where we are divided and not search for commonalities. So it failed. So let me jump ahead to the biggest breakthrough of the 20th century that opened up the world to a conversation, to a dialogue. We're now talking about the 1960s. We're talking about Vatican II. We're talking about the relationship between Pope John the 23rd, Cardinal Bia, who was the cardinal responsible for engagement with the Jewish people, and the appointed representative of the Jewish people, Abraham Joshua Heschel. So for years, Heschel would go back and forth to Rome, and sometimes Cardinal Bia would come to New York, where Heschel taught. And they worked on what became this, and was called the Schema on the Jews. So for the first time in 1800 years, the Roman Catholic Church said that Jews and Judaism did not share any responsibility for the death of Jesus the Christ. That's huge. That's revolutionary. That's an earthquake. The second part of the schema on the Jews that the Pope accepted was a statement that said, our historical engagement with Jews has always been seeking their conversion to Christianity. At this point, that attempt is concluded. So you can see how amazingly different the world looked after Vatican II. The one other thing that was asked by the church, of the church, was to change all the textbooks in churches and in Roman Catholic seminaries to reflect that change. That we, in their statement, that we are all brothers and sisters in faith and no longer competitors. Okay. Now, if you look at an evaluative view of how that worked out, it didn't work out all that well. Both John Paul and Pope Gregory both kind of cut corners on the whole thing and became much more controversial. But Heschel continued the dialogue in the United States with major Christian figures, particularly in the Protestant world, where theologians like Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich became close friends. And Abraham Joshua Heschel became the first Jew to ever formally teach at Union Theological Seminary in New York, the leading interdisciplinary and interfaith seminary. And the bylaws of that institution had to be changed by the board to allow a non-Christian to teach. That was revolutionary also. Now let's jump ahead to Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi. From the time he was a student in the late 40s, he became intrigued by reading books in the New York Public Library that were forbidden by the school that he went to, the yeshiva that he went to in New York. But he read them and discovered that people representing all the different spiritual traditions, both Christian, Muslim, and Eastern, shared the same level of inquiry about the interiority of an individual. And he was a developing spiritual person and had lots of questions that weren't answered in his tradition. And so when he found in the books that he read secretly, he became in many ways overwhelmed by the possibilities of deepening his own spiritual tradition through encounter with others. He eventually, in 1998, he gave a week-long teaching in upstate New York at a retreat center on deep ecumenism, which Nadya and I were privileged to attend. And some of his high points were in a question, where do you think, or how do you think that any spiritual tradition has all the answers to all the questions? He said, every spiritual tradition is bereft of all the answers. So why not, as in his language, Zalman's language was, then what we have to do is find the vitamins in other traditions that will fructify and make healthy Judaism. And his notion was, don't talk theology when you want to engage somebody else. As he defined it, theology is the afterthought of a spiritual experience. Theology is only words that are used to describe what happened to you. All right. And so he would say in the Western Christian tradition, if you want a dialogue, you one ask the other, how do you get it on with God? I'm using Zalman's language. And the second is sit down and read the Psalms together, because the Western traditions share the Psalms, Islam and Christianity and Judaism. When it came to the Eastern traditions, he began to explore the commonality of meditation. There was no meditation in Judaism, it seemed. The 19th century Enlightenment rationalism that was brought to the forefront was not interested in those things of mysticism and the whole mystical tradition, the Kabbalah and the Hasidic movement of spiritual renewal in the 18th century Europe. But Zalman knew that there was a Jewish tradition of meditation, but his interest grew to experience with in ashrams and in Buddhist retreat centers and everything, the spiritual traditions of meditation from the East. And the highlight, really the highlight of this Eastern engagement was twofold. One, on his retirement from Temple University, they established at Naropa University here in Boulder, for the first time, a chair in worldly wisdom, and he was the first occupant. So there he is, a Jewish thinker and spiritual teacher, occupying this chair at the only major Buddhist university in the Western world. Then what happened, the second thing that was really major, was an invitation to him to put together a group of Jewish leaders to come and hang out with the Dalai Lama, because the Dalai Lama, exiled from Tibet with his followers, had one major question: how do you keep the faith going for the next generation when you're living in exile? And the Dalai Lama was wise enough to know that the experts on that issue are the Jews. So he invited them to come to Dharamsala and engage in several weeks, both with him and other Buddhist priests there, in exploring that question. And a wonderful book, The Jew in the Lotus, was written by one of the people who was on that trip. A movie was made about it. And what's not known, because that what didn't show up in the book or the movie, was the post-trip. What happened after that? And Buddhist priests began working with Jewish pedagogical experts to develop curricula for the Tibetan community. And it's ongoing to this day. So I'll just summarize by saying, for me, and Nadya can speak to it also, deep ecumenism may well be the most important spiritual effort at our time. It is certainly the most necessary for the relationship between spiritual traditions. Anything other than that is just going back into a sordid history. And the rewards are enormous, because you get to ingest those vitamins from other traditions, not from fear, but from gratitude. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Victor. We got 2 thumbs up from Grace.
So,
hi, Nadya. Go ahead.
thank you. So I want to take it from here to how do we live into this very important concept, and why does it matter for the work that we do in social justice and social action? Because that's really what we share in common. So, and first I want to take a step back and say that Victor and I have founded this organization, Yerusha, which means in Hebrew legacy, to carry Reb Zalman's legacy forward. And so we are a Jewish organization deeply committed to deep ecumenism. And we also serve a small Jewish renewal congregation here in Boulder, Colorado, that shares space with a Lutheran church. So our kids call it the synagogue, the place where we were meeting up until COVID. And we have developed incredibly close relationships with both the spiritual leaders of these churches, as well as the members, and brought our members into relationship with each other so that we are practicing deep ecumenism all the time. So how do you do it? That's really the question. I think that once we get to understand what it is and how it's developed and where it's failed and where it's succeeded, how do we do it as just normal human beings in the 21st century? And so I would say that it begins with a grounding in self. What I believe, when we look at the history, what made it so difficult for people to meet one another, and Victor's early stories of visiting the synagogue and the church, there were rules. I don't think you said this, Victor, but he generally says, the rabbi would say to them, now they're going to get down on their knees, you don't, right? It was all about how we're different, and this fear that if we did what the other did, that we were somehow going to lose who we were. And so we really have to come into this practice grounded in ourselves, knowing who we are, knowing what we believe in, but ultimately also knowing ourself as part of this great divine whole that we call creation. So if divinity is that underground river that is feeding each of these wells, and we access it through our unique wells, it also feeds each of us uniquely, each of us individuals. Every aspect of creation is fed by this divine source and contains that same divinity. So Reb Zalman, one of the image that I loved the best that he used in describing deep ecumenism was what he called the organismic model. He, of course, subscribed to this earth, Gaia, as a living, breathing organism. And he said that all of the religious traditions were like different organs in the body. If Gaia was the entire body, then each tradition, each culture was a different organ in the body. Each of us, each organ has its unique responsibility and its unique role to play in keeping the body alive. The heart does its job, and the kidneys do their job, and the liver does its job, and the stomach does its job. And no one organ can do the job of the other. However, all of the organs need each organ to be healthy and fully functioning for it to continue to do its job. And so what he saw was that it was important for us to understand what is our unique role as Buddhists, as Jews, as Christians, as Muslims, whatever. We need to know what is our role in the whole, and then we need to have and support the health of every other organ, every other religious tradition, so that we can do our job and they can do their job. And together, the whole is being kept alive and functioning as it should. And so we not only need to understand the role of the other organs and celebrate it and support it, we need to make sure that it is as healthy as it can be, as we keep our organ as healthy as it can be. And then we come to understand that each role is unique and essential to the whole, And no one is more important than the other. Because if the kidneys fail, everything fails ultimately. If the heart fails, the rest of it fails. If the brain fails, the rest of it fails, right? And so there is no one that is going to keep the whole going if the other ones or any of the other ones fail. So there is no one organ that is more essential or more important than the rest. So I'm getting a message that there's a problem with my sound. Okay. I guess my mouth was moving at a different pace than my words were coming through. Okay. So when we come to understand how we are each uniquely essential and no one is more essential than the rest, then that whole idea of I'm more important, or God loves me best, or whatever becomes ridiculous. And it shifts something in us. And to me, the practice of deep ecumenism has really created in me that clarity that that each encounter that I engage in is precious, unique, and is going to serve me as I serve it in some essential and positive way. It removes that the paternalism, the condescension. So when we bring that knowledge and that experience of deep ecumenism into our work in the world, we cannot come from that place of, you know, I'm the great white hope that's going to help make you better, right? Or I'm coming from this place of my elevated high state from some kind of condescending, paternalistic worldview to serve you, to heal you. It's more coming to work as a conscious and conscientious whole, each serving the other and discovering what each of us has to offer the other. So what I've learned in doing this work, and particularly in the relationships that we've nurtured and cultivated with our Lutheran community, is that when I come to hear their story, when I encounter their faithful acts in the world, coming from their God sense, from their sense of divinity and their call to service, when I hear their story, when I encounter them from a place of open-hearted love, a place of being equal in this world, right? Without judgment, without that judge in me that tries to discern which is right and which is wrong, I actually begin to see myself, my reflection, my faith reflected in their faith, my truth reflected in their truth.
Nadia, it would appear that your video has frozen. I'm not sure. You're not moving and we can't hear you. If you want to restart, we'll sit tight here for a moment. If you can hear me. I think she heard me because she dropped off, so she'll probably enter back in.
Back in. I'm back. I'm sorry.
No worries. Thank you.
humble apologies. I think it's all the children in our neighborhood who are going to school right now online. Probably impacts my Wi-Fi. I don't know where I got lost, where you lost me. And what I want to simply close with here is that this work of recognizing self in other and doing that work in the reflection, in the mirrored reflection of one another's faith and sense of being sourced in that same divine source, takes us beyond witnessing into deeply encountering and embodying one another's practices, traditions, where we do emerge out of that encounter fully, truly transformed, having access to the vitamins that don't exist in our source. We come to really experience the world in a completely different way than we had before when we stayed on the outer edges of our differences. So I think that that's enough from me. I want to invite and open it to questions and insights and thoughts that want to be shared by all of you.
Thank you so much, Nadya. And I want to just reinforce Nadya's invitation. These sessions are always so much richened, if that's proper, by the dialogue and the interaction that goes on after the presentation. So I really, really welcome any and all of you to, and we're a small group, so we don't need to do the electronic hand. If you want to just wave your hand and then unmute yourself, I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself, and I will sit back. I have 6 or 8 questions already, so I'll be graceful here and let you all take the floor. So anyone with a question or a comment, or please. Graham, thank you. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Graham.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, both of you. I was lucky enough to spend a career teaching religions, world religions, in what we call here in the UK secondary school. And I just wish I'd have had a few of your turns of phrase and explanations. I loved the one about different organs requiring health and also support. And a lot of familiar names were mentioned as well, Martin Buber and indeed Matthew Fox. So I don't really have any questions, but just deep gratitude that I wanted to express to you both. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate that. Anyone else here with a Georgia? Welcome. Hi from Germany.
Yes, hi from Germany. I'm very intrigued by your presentation from both of you, and I found it very interesting to get to know about the connection with Germany. And I wonder if there are any connections you have with Germany, and if you offer any, I don't know, talks or practical seminars or something on your work. I mean, that would really intrigue me, because I studied comparative religious studies. I'm at home in the Lutheran Church, and I'm a Buddhist, Zen Buddhist, in the Zen peacemaker tradition. So I find it really fascinating to listen to you.
Thank you, Georgia. One of you like to respond?
I'll take just a little bit, and then Nadya can do the practical stuff. There, of all the places in Europe where the dialogue has ensued would be at the Vatican, both during the time of Pope John the 23rd in the 60s, and the current Pope Francis, who is one of the most amazing popes, I think, in Roman Catholic history, and in Germany, because one of the leading Catholic theologians, Hans Küng, who teaches at what I think Tübingen, has been open for most of his career to the dialogue between the different religions. He's written massive books on Islam and then Judaism, and of course on Christianity. And I know that at one time, years ago, Reb Zalman was in Germany, and he engaged in a symposium with Hans Küng. And so that's one of the places that is more open to investigating the dialogue. There are countries in Europe that aren't into that, all right? One of the most interesting things that took place in Europe and in the United States was a person who just died a few years ago, I think about 6 years ago, Ramon Panakar. This is the most fascinating individual because he was ordained as a Roman Catholic priest by the Vatican and sent to India because his father, as I remember it, was a Hindu. And what he pulled off was the most amazing respect and encounter between Hinduism and Catholicism. He later became a professor at Harvard Divinity, and also he chaired the Department of Religion at University of California, Santa Barbara, I believe. And he came up with a concept that I just wanted to very briefly mention. He went beyond Buber's dialogue. He said that the dialogue, when it takes place between an I and a thou, ends with respect and even love between the two parties. What Panakar advanced was what he called dialogical dialogue, in which the same encounter takes place, but both people are transformed in love. That's huge. That is huge to take place between people of different spiritual traditions, right? And I'll just conclude. Matt Fox said, religion isn't about institutions, it's about relationships. And if that's the case, we got a lot of work to do and a huge opening.
Thank you, Victor. Grace, I don't want to put you on the spot. You have a chat in here. Would you like to share it, or would you like me to read it, or neither?
Well, actually, it's kind of just a musing of thoughts I was having as I was listening to both Nadya and Victor, and I love the idea about, yes, it's relationships, and it's not about which door you open and where we go, and is there really even an other? If we're all sourced from the same river, how can we even have an other? And yet here we are in team human form, and we have a language, and those languages tend to separate. If it's German, Portuguese, English, we tend to have objects to point at. So right in there, it's baked in. Fertile ground for right, wrong, good, bad. Yeah, but I love the way the Dalai Lama came and said, "Hey, I want to talk to you. I want to talk to the Jewish people. How did you keep the faith and what your work is right now, your legacy, to forward it while you're in exile?" And the Jewish people were in exile, and Dalai Lama's in exile. So it takes really, I think it takes really good people and really good hearts and really beauty and love and goodness to walk this path of being, you know, letting myself be impacted right now by you. And not about my theology and not my, whatever my beliefs are, like you said, but how am I being impacted just by looking at all of you? Well, that's a little more than what I put in the chat, but I got going.
Thanks, Grace.
Thank you, Grace. I want to say a few things that arose for me as I was listening to you. That's so beautiful. And yes, we live in this creation, which is the place of multiplicity, right? In fact, the God of creation in the Hebrew scripture, the Torah, in the book of Genesis, which actually we share, right? The name for the God of creation in those opening passages is a plural name. Elohim, the God that creates, is plural. So we go from the simple unity to this multiplicity immediately at the moment of creation. And then, of course, shortly after that, in the book of Genesis, we read about the Tower of Babel, and it's supposed to explain where all the languages emerged from. So yes, we know that we live in a world of multiplicity. It's about it's about the lens through which we look at that multiplicity. And we have, for the most part, been enculturated to see that as the things that separate us. We are different. We speak different languages. We wear different clothes. We eat different foods. You know, we believe in different things, and therefore we are different. Or we can, as Meister Eckhart drew our attention, we can look at that underground river that nurtures and nourishes and from which everything grows, that common source. And then we can see the multiplicity as opportunity, as enrichment, as ways that we can become that much, our world is that much more because of the differences, and not that those differences separate us. I know that Bernie, you know, Bernie's blessing was that we should always see ourselves as other and the other as ourselves. And there's something beautiful in that. And at the same time, for me, it's, I want to see the divinity that is me in the mirror of the other, and hold up the mirror to them to see their divinity, so that we transcend the otherness, the differences, and we come to meet one another in that same source, same essence that we are. And then all the other stuff becomes enrichment.
Vitamins.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I think what I heard you say is, like, you know, come together, join in what we have in common, and integrate the differences. And maybe for me to just try to drop the language and just even drop the word I and you and just say us all the time. I don't know. I'm working on a new language, and when I run it backwards, it's going to make perfect sense.
You and Paul McCartney, right?
There's actually a book that is always misplaced in the library because they don't know if it's fiction or nonfiction, that I encountered in the 60s. It was based on archaeological work 2,000 years from now in this country that they don't know what it is. And they're unearthing artifacts like a Coke bottle and different products. And they all say, well, back then, made in USA. So they named this country the Weans. All right. So there's the language. We are all Weans.
Anyone else have a question or a comment or a contribution? Kanara, I'm so glad you made it in. Nice to see you.
Me too. Me too. And thanks. I have the lights off because I'm in a school. I'm at school right now, so we have to stay masked, all the time. But the lights are those really strong Walmart lights, and I just would rather be in the dark when I'm not teaching. I was going to say, oh, it's so fun to be with you and to be here. And the two immediate things, I think, Grace, after I heard your comment, and I was just thinking about also Jürgen, is it, that spoke from Germany? Did I say it right, Georgia? Sorry.
Georgia.
Georgia. Thank you for correcting me. I was thinking about how, like, for me, the practice of ecumenism, like, I think, Reb Victor, we've kind of talked about it sometimes, like, how does direct experience come before theology, or does theology come before direct experience? And how for some of us, we've grown up with theology from our traditions, family, before we ever had direct immediate experience with the relationship of any kind, with the sacred, whatever we call it. And some of us have maybe had direct experience and then later gone in search of, what do I call it, or what package do I give it, or what group do I join who maybe understands what I'm going through. And for some of us, maybe like me, like the dance of like, what was this? I think that was an experience, but then I also am filled with theology. I think, like, for me, so much of the practice, I think, has been lived before I had words for it. And I'll just give an example of something really meaningful. On Friday night, my partner is from a very Church of Christ background, and has like moved into some Buddhist multiplicity, unnameable faith. And his kiddos are growing up Christian. And we do Shabbat in our house we do Shabbat. And so the kids were there, and I set up the altar with the candles. And the kids are like learning what altars are and what they do and what we make. And so the little boy on Friday night, I was making the altar, and I don't ask them to do anything, but then they see me doing it and they're like, can I add something? And I say, of course. And he like ran to his bedroom and he brought out this little beautiful case of arrowheads that someone has given him. And that was his contribution to the altar, are these like 3 beautiful little arrowheads found in the desert. And I just was like tearing up so much that like he understood, like, so it felt like he was saying so much with that act of placing that on our altar as I lit candles, like of ancientness and of beauty and of like something you don't touch or do anything with, but it's important. And it's those things, like, I really love that question of like what practice is, because it just feels like a lot of just like, how do we be a living of it? And the other thought that was coming to mind as you were speaking, Reb Nadya and Grace, was like, I was thinking about how for me, like, poetry really feels like it's been one of my deepest teachers of deep ecumenism, because the more that I engage as a poet or as a lover of poetry, it like takes me across traditions to hearing the voices of mystic poets. And then I'm more interested in like what their connection is than what is the theology that maybe is the shroud of their relationship.
Wow. I just want to give an example of something that Kinarity triggered. One of the unfortunate effects of the Jewish people being exiled from their land was that they were exiled from land. They had no connection. In Christian Europe, they weren't allowed to own land. And so farming, ranching, all that for 1800 years disappeared. So now we're in a situation where, as Nadya expressed about Gaia consciousness, so where do the Jews come into Gaia consciousness? All right. Well, we don't have within our own sources. Our vitamins do not include that. So where to look? To the Native American, the indigenous peoples around the world's tradition, because they are the ones connected to Gaia, all right? And the fear that parochialism that Nadya mentioned, stifles that. But fortunately, Reb Zalman taught us that that's the only way to go. There is no other source except to get the vitamins from some other source. And we're doing that slowly but surely. We are incorporating that. And you look to the Eastern traditions for some of that enrichment too. And so, and the last thing I want to make, we're not trying to come up with a unitary religion. Oh, absolutely not. Just the opposite. The particularism has to be maintained, or else the vitamins aren't observable to somebody from another tradition. So that's what's going on now. That's the most exciting thing I think that's happening with spiritual traditions. We finally get to talk. We finally get to look and express. And even if there are differences, once you talk about commonalities, once you understand what you share in common, then to talk about differences is enriching rather than divisive. That's the way I experience it now.
Thank you, Reb Victor. Any other questions here? Maybe I'll jump in with a couple of mine, and then hopefully others will have a question or a contribution. One of them is somewhat operational or perfunctory. For many of us who are unfamiliar with or just becoming familiar with Reb Zalman, is there a book that you recommend that we might put in the chat that would be a really helpful entry into this thought and into deep ecumenism? There it is.
He's only about that. She's only about that size.
It's a somewhat Zen answer, I think, yeah, to the question.
So Jeff's asking about a book, Victor, that you might recommend for folks to become. Sadly, Reb Zalman was an oral teacher more than a writer, and so much that he's taught on deep ecumenism is actually really in YouTube videos, and but maybe there's something else, Victor, that you want to suggest.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is 1998 week-long teaching called Deep Ecumenism. It was so transformative, was taped and put out on a PDF, poorly edited. And now I'm working with somebody, I'm finishing up the editing of somebody who listened to the tapes and created a document. I'm going through it, and hopefully that I could make available through you, Jeff, for dissemination, because that's I mean, he wrote something like 14 books and hundreds of unpublished papers that are at the University of Colorado archives. But one of the interesting things to get a feeling of a different approach is his book called Judaism with Feeling. It's the first book.
Jewish with feeling.
A Jewish with feeling.
Jewish.
Right. That is evocative rather than prescriptive. I mean, most theological tracts of any religion is prescriptive. Here's what you do, to achieve whatever. He just evokes the spiritual condition, right? And I mean, one of the things I strongly suggest is that everybody get the daily postings of Father Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan priest in Albuquerque, who is deeply ecumenical and a mystic, and also the daily postings of Matt Fox. These are two of the more edgy people, all right? probably the most edgy, all right? Both coming out of the Catholic tradition, but have become, I mean, Rohr has somehow escaped notice. I once asked him, how come they didn't kick you out like Matt Fox? And his answer was, because I taught most of the bishops in this country at Fordham. So, and these are the people who bring to us the mystical tradition, and that's the only universal spiritual tradition, is the mystical. And I will say that I have much regret over the fact that from my junior year in high school and for so many years through seminary, I was well-bred rationalist, because that's the religion that was taught to me. And to overcome it, all right? I mean, when I went to Reb Zalman and said, what do? You say that theology, like Kinera was talking about, theology is the afterthought of a spiritual experience. What happens if you're introduced to theology before you even have a spiritual experience? And Zalman said, you're screwed, but there's a lot of work ahead of you, right? So that's, and so I recommend to you, Matt Fox has written very accessible books on the Christian mystics, which, lo and behold, most of them were women, all right? Whereas the Jewish mystics, up until the present time, were all men. So it's a male.
Well,
huh?
the ones who wrote.
The ones who wrote, that we can act, yes. I stand corrected by my partner, as usual. So those are wonderful sources. And I strongly recommend Heschel's books, because what you're getting is the precursor to Zalman. They shared a mystical tradition together, and they were friends for a period of time. And I'll get, once the editing is done, which is hopefully in the next few weeks, I'll give it to Jeff, and he can get it to all of you.
Wonderful. And
I want to add that I sorry, Jeff, I just want to add, because Georgia had asked earlier about teaching, you know, anything that we do. And just to let you know that our organization is in the process, so both producing this pamphlet of Reb Zalman's teaching on deep ecumenism, but also developing more courses that will be offered to the public in deep ecumenism, which Victor is working to create, and probably will not be unveiled before next fall. But just stay in touch with our organization, and you'll see what is emerging.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, as far as just a sort of an operational question goes, that was much richer than I expected. And I want to alert everyone to the chat. My friend Holly is providing resources in the chat. So please go ahead and copy those. I just turned on the save function, so we'll be able to save those in our chat, but she's giving links to Rohr and Matt Fox and a number of other resources there too. So go ahead and copy those out if you'd like. My and I'll just go ahead and my actual question. The world, the Middle East, the United States, Europe, is really experiencing these huge tensions between Islam and Christianity and Judaism. And I don't need to explain that, everyone knows. I'm wondering to what extent this work is including reaching out to involved with Islam. Is there that connection? It just seems so tragically and longingly necessary.
It is in Israel, believe it or not, despite the conflict, there are grassroots organizations of Jews and Muslims working together, and they're not on a theological basis. They're working for the most desired goal that we could imagine, peace, right? Here in the United States, it really, I mean, you know, and the only way to describe Muslims in the United States is to say they were the largest invisible group in America. All right, I mean, their presence predates the United States itself. They were involved in the colonies. They fought in the Revolutionary War, but nobody knows that. And I think that if there one benefit, which is odd to say, of 9/11 was after the initial hatred and targeting of Muslims, there suddenly was a desire to get to know them, to interact with them, and it's ongoing. And initially, when Nadya and I began in 2003 with the Lutheran Church here in Boulder, we invited the imam and a group of Muslims from Denver to come and share the high holidays, the end of our high holidays with us. And it was also during the month of Ramadan. So they came, it was perfect because we both broke their fast and our fast at the same time. On the other hand, they were very reluctant, had an element of fear about going out into the community. And from people that we know in Detroit, where it's the largest Muslim population in the United States, there still is a reluctance to reach out, particularly during the last 4 years of the Trump administration and that attitude towards Muslims. So that's our work. I mean, that really is the work in this country, is to really bring them. I mean, there are what, 5-6 million Muslims in the country, about the same number as Jews. Jews have become prominent and relatively accepted in the United States. There's still anti-Semitism, but compare it to anti-Islam and anti-Muslim and anti-Arab. So that's our work. That really is our work.
I'd like to make an observation. One of the programs of Yerusha, I'm a board member at Yerusha, is the pilgrimage to the Holy Land, which has happened twice in the history of Yerusha, and hopefully will happen again as soon as travel and accommodations can work out. And I'd really encourage either Reb Nadya or Reb Victor to talk briefly about that event and what's behind it, because it was profoundly moving and valuable to myself and my wife and to the other 20 or so participants who were on our trip in 2018.
Thanks, Mark. So I'll respond first, and then if Victor wants to fill in my blanks. So we have been taking this interfaith spiritual pilgrimage to Israel and Palestine, and we lead it, Victor and I co-lead it with a Lutheran pastor couple, a husband and wife team who are Lutheran pastors, who are very dear friends of ours. And we bring together Christians and Jews and folks from the US of other faith traditions to go on this interfaith pilgrimage. And it has been really important to us when we first land there that our first encounter is also brings in the Muslim population of Israel, the Palestinians. We visit in Palestine, and in fact, our next trip is already under construction. We just don't have exact dates yet because of COVID. And now that things have it's become a little bit easier to visit certain parts of Palestine. So we meet with folks, the grassroots folks who are doing this peace work and the work of coming together out of their shared love for this land and their sense of shared origins in this land. And then, of course, the Christians get to see and walk in the footsteps of Jesus and experience their roots in that land. And the whole idea is for us to really come to understand, by being in this place together, that we have so much in common. Most importantly, our longing and our sense of connection and our sense and that longing to return to the roots. And it's a profoundly moving experience that is very transformative. And I'm going to let Victor say whatever he wants to say, and I'm going to go look for a link to a video that was done from our first trip, and we'll put it in the it's on YouTube, so you all can easily access it.
I'll just add that our very first trip, so we've actually had 3, but one of them was organized by a group in Los Angeles. And we went with, we co-led with an imam in Los Angeles and an Episcopal priest. And there we spent half the time in Palestine and half the time in Israel. And the encounters, it was one of the things that taught us how to do it better, not right, but better. And that was that it was very political, the very first one, and a very argumentative. And that was not our desire, but it was by the nature of who we encountered in Palestine and who we encountered in Israel. And so when we were able to plan the next 2, it was much more of the encounter with those who are doing the work for reconciliation. For me, I learned reconciliation by doing the work with the court in Boulder for 6 years of a different approach, and also studying the reconciliation project in South Africa after white rule ended, and now, you know, got a new way to learn to do it right, and that's through the peacemakers. So, and there's no, I mean, there's a lot of contention around the world, right? There's more contention than peace, it seems, but there's no place that is so focused on disagreement than the Holy Land, because the 3 Western religions come together there in conflict more than any attempt to reconcile. And the people, not the leaders, the people are fed up and tired of it. And so they're looking for ways out. And it's a lot of, you know, it's almost experimentation because it's never been done. It's like a couple steps forward very hesitantly, but the fruits of it, you can see it. Yeah. Right? I just have been watching some videos of, there's a group of rabbis for human rights, and they just finished the olive harvest in Palestine, where the settlers have a tendency to destroy the trees, uproot the harvest period for the Arabs living in Palestine. And so a group of Jewish spiritual leaders go there and harvest. All right. So it's those type things that we're looking at to do.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Victor and Nadya, I'll just remind us, you attended the Auschwitz Bearing Witness, or the plunge we just finished, and Sami Awad and Dina Awad were there. They're peacemakers in the Holy Land, as well as one of our board members, Tani Katz, and his wife Iris Katz. They live in in Tel Aviv, and they're deeply involved in this work. In fact, this last spring, they had planned an in-person bearing witness retreat in the Holy Land, and for obvious reasons, sadly, had to cancel. But they're tenacious and they're committed, and they will try again. So perhaps that's a connection. When you are ready to re-engage there too, we can make those introductions just to have more people.
It's interesting that while we were listening to them, so first of all, I heard both Dina and Sammy and just was crying copious tears. I was so deeply moved by everything that they shared and the work that they're doing. And I quickly texted to Victor, because we sit in different rooms in our house, right? I texted to Victor and said, these are people that we need to connect with for our next trip. So we've already, made notes of their work and their contact information. So
wonderful. Yeah. And if we can be instrumental in making that introduction, I'm happy to do that. So that's wonderful. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. We have just a few more minutes here. If someone else has a question or a comment, we've whittled down just a bit to a smaller group, but this is quite intimate this way. I love this.
A question for me. Do you think it's possible to be a mystic without having a root tradition attached to that, like without being a Jewish mystic or a Christian mystic, or like to just be a mystic who absorbs from all?
A mystic is one who has a direct experience of the mystery. So, and truthfully, Kinneret, I grew up in a mystical tradition. So I was raised by a grandmother who was a mystic, and her mysticism, while profoundly Jewish, also bears elements of pre-patriarchal Canaanite religion, because her lineage goes all the way back to before temple times in the land of Israel. And so when I came to the United States, I was sharing with Jeff yesterday that I came to the United States as an adolescent, and all of my friends went to Hebrew school. And of course, I didn't have to go to Hebrew school because I was coming from the country where that was my language. But our next door neighbors were Buddhists, and their kids went to Japanese school. So I decided to go with them to learn Japanese. But I also started to learn a lot about their Buddhist traditions. And so many of the things I was learning there sounded an awful lot like stuff I'd learned from my grandmother, but just with different terms. And already at a very young age, I was 14 or 15, when I came to the conclusion that the mystics, all had, they were all speaking the same truth, because there can only be one truth. There's only one creation and there's only one creator. So they're all speaking the same truth. However, when the mystics accessed that divinity, and then they came out of that access and wanted to share it with their community, it was shared through the lens and the language of that community. So it sounds different on the outside, but when you scratch the surface, it's all coming down to the same truth. Right? So I would say, yes, you can be a mystic without having a source tradition. But then the question is, what is the language that you will use to share your experience? And with whom will you be sharing it? And how do they come to understand that deep truth that you're trying to share?
And I'll just add that the Jewish mystical tradition is misogynistic, all right? By the absence of any of the divine feminine voice coming down, by its nature, the written stuff that we have is masculine. And that's why I recommend Matt Fox's books on the Christian mystics, because so many of them were women. And there is a universalism involved in it. You take, for example, we just listened to a week ago to Matt talking about his latest book is on Julian of Norwich. Well, the interesting thing about her is she originally was Jewish. So her mysticism is profoundly universal, number one. Number two, it's coming from a woman. And number three, why it's so important now. And the subtitle of Matt's book is in pandemic times. She was the mystic in the medieval pandemic. So how she relates to that on a mystical level, all right, is profound. So, I mean, your question is great because the answer is yes, 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 all right? There is no no, all right? Because the rational of religions are institutionalized and particularistic to the core. Mysticism is the universal language of spirit and of the divine, even with those Eastern traditions that question whether there is a divine. I'm well aware of that. Okay.
Wonderful. Kanara, thank you for the question. That was great. And we are coming to the close of our time, and somewhat off to the side, since Kanara did manage to make it to our session, I just want to give her a plug. She is one of my favorite young poets, and I'm waiting to see her published soon. So, watch for that to happen. I have a poem. I have a number of her poems that I read out loud to others. I love them so much. So, perhaps we close, and I want to offer my deep thanks to Reb Victor and Reb Nadya. And Nadya's going to grab something here. She has something to show.
I actually have a poem that I wanted to share with everyone because it says so much of what we've been talking about, and because you brought up poetry. And also because the shared work of bearing witness and loving action that we share in both our organizations. I just want to share this poem. It's by Kathleen Kramer. It's titled "You Must Cease." You must cease to be afraid of, or your life will stay small and trembling, and what you have to give will shrivel and finally be as if it never was. To truly live, to live your part that the mystery needs in order to change the world, you must enlarge your heart to its definition of courage. You must hold hands with your trembling child and walk together with every hand, every size and shape and color, every hand of our one human race towards the fresh, high place where we all belong and where the light there makes us all see and all be bravely known.